Well, hi, welcome back to Discipleship Squared. Sorry I have been absent for a couple of weeks. I was pretty sick for about, 8 or 9 days, and so I'm just a little bit behind, but we'll try to catch up on our schedule. Today we want to talk about uh, common ancestry, and that is a thing that is often used by evolutionists, evidence for common ancestry to kind of prove evolution. So let me share my screen here. And we'll get it going. There we go. So when you talk about origins, evolutionists say that we all came from one particular critter somewheres in a long time ago. Typically, what you see is a picture, something like this, sometimes called the phylogenetic tree, or the molecules to man theory is what evolution is sometimes called, because evolutionists believe that the very first critters were some type of maybe protist or some type of maybe even bacteria. And eventually that changed over hundreds of thousands of years by small mutations until you started having different things show up because of survival of the fittest. So you started with a molecule, a very small type of critter. Usually, most people, evolutionists, say that it was some type of heterotroph because it'd be easier to make a heterotroph, something that grabs something else, than to make like something that can make its own food. But eventually, what supposedly happened is over many, many thousands and hundreds of thousands and actually millions of years that these developed into more and more complex creatures. And so, you had invertebrates develop, and you had crustaceans and arachnids and mollusks, and then you had a vertebrate line that developed. So you got fish and amphibians and reptiles, and then birds, and of course, mammals. And finally, supposedly the most complex one was man. And of course, we had the plants as well. And so you have a lot of different kinds of plants that supposedly developed. And so this is the basic idea. It's called the molecules to man theory. I sometimes call it the frog to Fred theory, because basically what the idea here is that we all had a common ancestor. And so evolutionists use this a lot of times, evidence to try to show this. Here's one example. Um, if you look at critters and all kinds of critters here, there's a few things that we all have in common. One of the things we have in common is a chemical called cytochrome C, okay? And it's made up of amino acids. And this is used in the uh, respiration system to help pass along certain enzymes, okay? And so this cytochrome C, you can find this in almost every organism there is. Now, if we all came from a common ancestor, then that kind of makes sense that we would all maybe have something similar. But what evolutionists say is if you look at these, the things that evolve first compared to us would have a lot of differences. So for instance, like we're a human, okay, and a human is supposedly kind of closely related to a chimpanzee. There's very little difference actually between the genetics of a chimpanzee and a human. And so if you look at the cytochrome C in a human and you look at a cytochrome C of a chimpanzee and you look at the amino acid differences, there's none. We're almost exactly like a chimpanzee. And we're pretty close to like other critters that are related, like rhesus monkeys. And evolutionists say this would be expected because, we just, evolved from chimpanzees or monkeys not too long ago. And so we would be pretty closely related to them. Now, if you look down here where you have rabbits and then you have cows, well, they're more, they're mammals, but notice how many more differences they have than we do. And again, an evolutionist says, well, that would be expected because cows and rabbits came a lot sooner on the evolutionary time frame than like monkeys and chimpanzees. And so they would have bigger differences. And as you go down this chart, you've got birds and then you got frogs, which are amphibians, and then you have like insects. And as you go down this chart, you get more and more differences between us as our cytochrome and the cytochrome in very simple organisms such as wheat germ or yeast. And so evolutionists point to this and they say this is a great example of the fact that we all came from a common ancestor. And we share some of the same stuff as like even a cell as simple as a yeast, but there's a lot more differences between that than there are between, like, say, amphibians, because they came later, and birds came even later, and mammals that came even later, and eventually, chimpanzees, and then we came along. And so evolutionists often point to this as evidence for we came from a common ancestor. Another thing that we talk about sometimes, evolutionists talk about, is as an evidence for common ancestry is called homologous organs or homologous structures. Homo meaning same and structure meaning structure. If you look at a human arm and a lizard, like their front leg, and a cat's front leg, and a whale's fin, and a bat, and all of these different critters here, you can see that there's a lot of structures that are very, very similar. So like a frog came a lot sooner according to the evolutionary time scale. A frog, or say a lizard, came a lot sooner. But you can see there are very similar structures here in the front, limb of a frog and the front limb of a lizard. They have a radius and an ulna in their arms. They have, metacarpals and carpals and digits. And then, other critters do as well. Even a whale, which is a fish, which came a long time ago, it has something that we think is similar to a radius and an ulna and digits. And if you look, all of them seemingly have very similar structures. And what evolutionists say is the reason why they have similar structures is because we all came from a common ancestor. We all came from a whale, but a whale's arms or front flippers eventually changed and got a little bit longer to form, say, maybe a amphibian or something like that. But these organs kind of changed, and they helped those, whatever the change happened, it helped the animals survive. And so survival of the fittest, we got different kinds of things, and yet they're all based on the same basic structure, suggesting that they all came from a common ancestor. And so homologous organs are, in almost every textbook that I've ever seen in biology in high school, this is an example of evidence for evolution. Here's another picture of the same kind of deal. Here's a penguin, here's an alligator, here's a bat, and here's a human ant. And you can see these, the cat and the whale and stuff, and they all have similar structures. And again, evolutionists say those homologous structures are because we all came from a common ancestor. And that seems to make pretty good sense to a lot of people when this is first talked about. The other thing oftentimes used to support common ancestry is we even show common ancestry as an embryo. Guy that first came out with this idea was Haeckel. He was back in the 1860s, I think, or 1870s, something like that. And what he noticed is he took a look at different critters. And for instance, these are all different embryos. And notice they all look almost exactly alike. But as you follow down the chart, this is like a fish embryo. This is a salamander. This is a tortoise. These are chicks. These are a hog, a mammal, a calf, a rabbit here, and finally a human. But notice, we're quite a lot different down here in the bottom row, But up in this row, we're pretty similar. And in fact, when we first develop embryos, according to evolutionists, I mean, we're really similar. I mean, we almost look like a fish. Here's these little things right here. Those are called gill slits, and we have his tail. And salamanders have that, and tortoises have that, and chicks have that, and even you, when you were first an embryo, had these little things that look like these gill slits. And so evolutionists say that, well, why would that happen? Well, we may have a common ancestry, and as we first develop as an embryo, we kind of go through some of the stages that our ancestors went through. The technical term is called ontogeny, in other words, embryological development, recapitulates or repeats phylogeny, in other words, the phylogenetic tree. And so the idea here is that evolutionists say that even as an embryo, we show that we had common ancestry. So you have this amino acid sequences, like in cytochrome, and there's some other ones too, hemoglobin and things. And we have homologous structures, and even our embryos show evidence of common ancestors. And so evolutionists say, man, these are really good evidences that we all came from, a common ancestor. So a lot of evolutionists say, this is really good evidence that supports evolution. But I would say, or does it? I want you to look at this picture. Now, some of you may have seen a picture like this before, but maybe some of you haven't. There are two ladies in this picture. One is an old hag, and another one is a really young lady. I want you to just take 30 seconds or so and see if you can see both of them. One is an old hag, and one is a very beautiful young lady. I'll let you look at them for a minute. Did you find them? I do this with my students all the time, and I have some people that can find both of them, and then a lot of people I have that can see one but not the other. Let me try to help you to actually see them. So here's the first one. This is the old hag. This is the face of the old hag. This is her chin. This is her mouth. This is the side of her nose. Here's her left eye. And you can just barely see the eyebrow of the right eye, but you can't see any more than that. Okay. She has a shawl over her head and a big furry kind of coat like. She's kind of looking kind of down to the right of the screen here. Did you see that one? Some people don't see that when they first look at that picture. Here's the other picture. Now, you have to kind of look a little differently here. This is the face of the young lady. She's actually looking over her right shoulder, kind of towards the back of the picture. You can just barely see her nose here pointing that way and her eyelids, but this would be from her right eye now. This is her ear right here. This is her jawbone along here. And then this is her neck down here, and she has some kind of bracelet on. This has nothing to do with a mouth or a chin or anything like that. It's the necklace. She's looking over her right shoulder towards the back of the screen. She has a little, a hat-like thing or a shawl or scarf as well, and she has this coat on, furry coat, but she's a young lady rather than an old lady. Now, what's important about this? Well, the thing I really want you to tell or understand is that these pictures, this picture here, right here, we're all looking at the same thing. But a lot of times people can only see one or the other. And I would submit to you that what happens in some of the cases with the evidence that's produced that supports evolution is that, did we all come from one ancestor? Well, evolutionists point to and say, well, yeah. And what they do is they see this whole phylogenetic tree And they see these amino acids, and they say, well, we all came from a common ancestor, and we came from a common ancestor because of our embryological stuff shows it, and our homologous organs show it. But I would submit to you that there's another thing that could be true here. These are all pictures drawn by a guy named Rembrandt. He's a pretty famous author, painter. And if you look at Rembrandt's paintings, do you notice there's a lot of similarities in them? First of all, he does pretty well close-up types of things and gets a lot of facial expressions, and the facial expressions are pretty serious. You don't see a bunch of laughter or anything. They have these dark backgrounds and dark clothes. Even this one with kids, they're lighter clothes, but they're still shades of dark. And if you're a really good artist, and you're really good at art, you probably can just recognize after you've seen so many Rembrandts, you can just recognize, oh yeah, that's probably a Rembrandt. Here's another painter. This is Monet. He's a French guy. And notice his pictures are there's a lot of similarities in there too. It's kind of like these light colors, these more pastel colors, nature scenes rather than a lot about people. There's boats and there's water and there's sky and there's usually some flowers in them and stuff. Again, Monet had this kind of style that he always painted with, and you can recognize a Monet painting after you've seen a lot of paintings of his. You can almost recognize when you see it. And of course, this one here, I'm sure a lot of you maybe already knew this one. This is that cuboidal style, and that was made famous by a guy named Picasso. And once you see a few of these, you can almost always recognize it because of this cuboidal style that he knows or he used. Well, I would submit to you that yes, you could look at some of this data and say, well, we all came from a common ancestor. But we could also say that that data suggests not a common ancestor, but a common designer. That a person or a creative being who designed something might use similar structures and similar things in similar ways. So, like if a did the cytochrome, was it because it evolved, or was it the fact that the creator actually used a common design? And so there's more differences between a chimpanzee and there's less differences between a chimpanzee and a human than there are between like a yeast and but the yeast was designed for different purposes. And so maybe as we go farther and farther apart in these animals, the creator used a common design. So there are some similarities, but there are also some differences. Same way here. It looks like, in terms of the front hand or the front limb, that there's an awful lot of similarities between that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we all came from a common designer or a common ancestor. It may mean that a common designer designed them and used similar structures because they work best. One of the ones we haven't talked about yet was the vertebrate heart. Now, if you look at vertebrate hearts in a fish, Pisces, in fish, the fish have two chambered hearts, an atrium and a ventricle. The ventricle receives blood from the atrium receives blood from the body, and then the ventricle pumps it out to the body. So the ventricle is usually a little bit larger and stronger. In amphibians, there's a three-chambered heart instead of two chambers. There's a ventricle and two atriums. And this partly helps the frog or amphibians to use blood in a more efficient way. And then if you look at reptiles, they have like almost 3.5 chambers. There's a big septum here in the middle that almost divides it up, not quite. So you get this mixing of blood just like here, okay? But it's not mixed nearly as well, so it's more efficient. And then when you look at like birds and mammals, they have a 4-chambered heart. And this this one side is basically for lungs and the other side is basically for the body. And evolutionists said, well, boy, this is, this whole idea of simple to complex. Here's a simple design, and then it got more complex over time and more complex over time. And finally, the most complex type things are the animals that evolved in the last, just a few million years. Well, is that true? Or did it come from a common designer? If ventricles work and atriums work in a fish, because they don't, they don't have to work at getting oxygen quite so bad because it comes through the gills, then, you might only need two chambers. But like in amphibians and reptiles, they need more. But then when you talk to birds and mammals, they use oxygen in such a, a potent way that you almost need these two different systems in order to happen. Now, it makes perfect sense that a designer might use the same structure, just like certain designers use the same kinds of things when they build buildings. Now, let's go back to those Haeckel drawings here, Haeckel. And the reason why I bring this up is because, like I said, if you look at these things, boy, they look almost exactly alike. And so, I remember having a professor talk to me and say, well, yeah, when you were an embryo, you had gill slits and you had a tail just like a fish did, or just like a monkey did, or things like that. And, that sounded pretty thing. And so pretty, what made sense to me. And so this whole idea of ontogeny, the development of an embryo, recapitulating or going through the phylogenetic tree, it just kind of made sense. But what I didn't know when I first saw this, and oftentimes this is not included in textbooks, okay? But this is the drawings that Haeckel made when he first presented his theory back in the 1860s or 70s, whatever it was. And the reason why is because he had to draw them because they couldn't take pictures of this stuff. But below these are pictures that are actual present day pictures of this. Here's a fish embryo, and here's the real embryo. Here's the salamander, but here's the real picture of the salamander. Here's Haeckel's drawing of a turtle. Here's his drawing of a chicken. Notice it. These don't look at all like these pictures. I mean, why were these pictures changed from what he actually saw? And a lot of people believe now that Haeckel was doctoring these drawings so that people would believe in this whole idea of ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. If you take this a step farther and look at the fertilized egg and how it develops into these things, notice like here's a fish and here's a fish egg and how it develops. Here's a amphibian egg and look how it develops. Here's a turtle, and notice it isn't at all like that. And like, here's humans. I mean, look at the difference there. So when you're talking about embryology and you look at these, boy, there's not a lot of similarities here at all. Ontogeny doesn't recapitulate phylogeny. In fact, this is so much scientists who are in the know now, don't ever use this as an argument to support evolution because it really doesn't look like it happened at all. So, is it common ancestry or is it a common designer? Well, you have to decide. But I would say that you have just as much right to believe that these things like homologous structures and embryological development stuff could be just as easily explained by a common designer as they could be by common ancestry. So I hope you think about that. And I hope you take some time and just really, really, gotta stop my share here. There we go. I hope you just really, really think seriously about this whole common designer thing. There are so many things that are designed, and we'll be talking about some more of them later, but there's so many things that are designed, or at least appear to be designed. That is just as legitimate thing as saying we all came from a common ancestor.